Hello! Today I'm here with a video to talk about audiobooks and more specifically my relationship with audiobooks. Now, I've been an audiobook listener for just a little bit over a year now. In fact, according to my Audible account, I have been a member since the 20th of January 2018, and as I'm filming this it is the 30th of January 2019. So I've been an Audible member for a year and 10 days, and in that time I have learnt a lot about myself as an audiobook listener, I think, and I was trying to do a lot of research about audiobooks before I started listening, and I was really struggling to find any tips that were applicable to me. So I thought, I've been listening for about a year now and I feel like I've got my preferences with audiobooks down, so I figured I would share them with you. Now, the first audiobooks that, well, actually the very first audiobook I downloaded from Audible was the complete works of Sherlock Holmes by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, narrated by Stephen Fry. And this was the audiobook that I used my free Audible credit for, because when you sign up for Audible you get 30 days free, which means you get a 1 credit for free to use on any audiobook that you like, and you can keep it regardless of whether you keep your membership. And so I thought, let me get the longest audiobook I possibly can. So I think the that audiobook was about like 75 hours long or something. Needless to say, I haven't listened to all of it. I did listen to some, and I do really like Stephen Fry as a narrator, so I'd say that is my top tip, is find narrators that you like. And I think that the best way to find narrators that you like, or certainly in my experience, is to find, well, first of all, if there's an actor that you like the sound of their voice, maybe have a look on Audible or anywhere else to see if they've narrated any books that you might be interested in, or potentially just a television personality, or, you know, something like that, and see if they have narrated anything, because that's a really good place to start. And then also Audible have a lot of free audiobooks available, so it might well be worth downloading a few of those to see what kind of narrative styles you enjoy. I have discovered that I find it easier, or at least I certainly did at the beginning, I find it easier to absorb a story from a narrator with a British accent, an accent that is the same as mine, because then I don't get so thrown off by the accent. When I'm listening to the book, I'm able to focus more on the story, so maybe have a think about that as well. So I did listen to some of the Sherlock Holmes stories, but not that many, because in hindsight, really, that probably wasn't the best audiobook for me to select, because it is quite dense, and I have tried to read those books before and struggled for the same reason. And so my theory was that the more dramatised version through the medium of an audiobook would be better, and it was, but it was still not as good of a first audiobook experience as it could be, which brings me on to tip number 2, which is to choose your first audiobook wisely. And for me, after downloading the Sherlock Holmes stories, I then proceeded to every month get the Harry Potter books. So I listened to the entire Harry Potter series on audiobook in 2018. And again, I was lucky because it was narrated by Stephen Fry, which I already knew was a narrator that I really enjoy listening to and can absorb really well. But also I think it was very, very helpful that I was listening to a story that I was so familiar with, because I have read those books multiple times, I've watched the films multiple times, so if I got distracted, I could go back if I wanted to listen to it again, and you can wind back. and you can change the speed of the narration as well. You can either slow it down or speed it up. Actually, I don't know if you can slow it down. I've never tried that. I don't think you'd want to. Most audiobooks that I've listened to have been relatively slow paced anyway, in terms of narration speed. Not sure on that one, but you can definitely speed them up. And what was my point? So even if I got distracted from the story and didn't want to wind back, it didn't matter, because I already know the story of Harry Potter so well that if I missed anything, it really wasn't a problem. So I would suggest starting with a book that you are familiar with and that you have read before, potentially multiple times, just to get you into the audiobook thing, because I think that it's a very, very different form of reading, and the type of concentration that you need is slightly different, because when you're sat down reading a physical book, you can be distracted. Of course, you can pick up your phone, or the TV might draw your attention or whatever, but generally you're sat down and you're distracted only by things that are around you. Whereas for me, at least, when I'm listening to audiobooks, I'm usually travelling somewhere, and so there's a lot more to take away your attention, and you need to be aware. So for example, if I'm walking down the street and I need to cross the road, of course I need to pay attention to crossing the road. So it's just a different type of concentration, I find. And so listening, especially when you're first starting out, I think listening to something you're familiar with really helps you to get to know how your concentration levels work when you are listening to an audiobook. So that would be my second tip, is to start with something you're familiar with. And then once you've done that, if you do want to branch out, what I did was I branched out but into a genre that I'm really comfortable with. So naturally for me, I gravitated towards the fantasy genre, and I proceeded to download a trilogy in one audiobook. It was a compilation of all 3 books in one audiobook of a fantasy series, and I really enjoyed it. It wasn't a fantastic read. It was the Society of the Sword by Duncan Hamilton, I think. Let me check. Duncan M. Hamilton, yes, narrated by Derek Perkins, and I really enjoyed that, but it wasn't, amazing, and I don't think that was an audiobook issue. I think that was just that the story was just an okay story for me, and that's fine. And then after that, I read To Kill a Kingdom, which was a book that had just been on my TBR in general anyway. So I sort of thought, okay, I've got used to this audiobook thing now. I understand the kind of narrators that I like. I started off with British narrators because that was where I was most comfortable, and now certain American accents I still struggle with in that format. Just not in general, like I can watch anyone on YouTube or on television or anything. It's just this particular medium of audiobooks, I can find accents quite distracting, and I'll come back to that in a minute, because my next audiobook that I'm going to talk about was slightly influenced by that. But I thought, okay, I've read books with narrators that I'm comfortable with and books that I'm familiar with, and I've listened to a book that I didn't know previously but with a narrator that I felt comfortable with. So let me try branching out and reading just something that's on my TBR in general. So I picked up To Kill a Kingdom, and I really enjoyed it. I really enjoyed the story. It was a dual narration, so the female protagonist's narrative section was narrated by a female narrator and vice versa with the male narrative, and I really enjoyed it. I found it very easy to absorb the story. I didn't get lost. I had to wind back a few times, but that's always the case, and I found that really, really good. But then I tried to listen to Red Rising by Pierce Brown, narrated by Tim Gerard Reynolds, and Tim Reynolds has a very, very thick Irish accent, and I like the Irish accent, but it was too difficult for me to absorb the Irish accent and the story at the same time. It was just a bit too distracting, and I already have a tendency to find audiobooks a little bit difficult to focus on because, like I said before, usually I'm also traveling or something like that, so there's usually something else that's occupying my mind at the same time, so I have to have an audiobook that's really easy for me to follow, and I just found that Red Rising wasn't easy for me to follow. And part of that as well is because it was sci-fi. I don't read a lot of sci-fi. I don't actually remember the last... oh no, that's not true. The last time I read a sci-fi book was Skyward by Brandon Sanderson, but that was actually in November, and I tried to read Red Rising in October. So before Red Rising, I don't even remember the last time that I tried to read a sci-fi book or did read a sci-fi book. So I think that that was a mistake, and that is why I say if you're going to branch out of books that you know, stay within a genre that you feel comfortable with, because what I did was I threw myself way too far in at the deep end. I swapped to a narrator that I wasn't necessarily too comfortable with. I swapped to a genre that I wasn't necessarily too comfortable with, and a book that I had never read before, in a world that I'd never read a book in before. So that kind of spoiled my experience of Red Rising, and that's a shame because it is a book that has been on my TBR for a while, and I DNF'd the audiobook because I just couldn't focus on it. So I'm keeping the audiobook because I do plan to read the book as a physical book at some point, and then once I've done that, if I enjoyed the story, then at least I have the audiobook for rereads. Which brings me on to my sort of closing thoughts on this subject. Basically, my opinion on audiobooks for myself now is that I'm going to use them for rereading, and I have a few reasons for this. Firstly, like I said before, I find rereading on audio a lot easier for me to absorb the story because I already know what's going to happen in the story. So if I miss little sections here and there, it's really not the end of the world. I can pretty much pick up what was going on because I already know what happened from having read the book before. So that's one point. Another point is that it means that because of that, I don't need to be quite as selective with my narrators because I'm familiar with the story, and so if I'm slightly distracted by the narration style or the narration accent, then it won't matter quite as much because, again, I'm familiar with the story, and so any minor distractions shouldn't hinder my reading experience too much. And thirdly, and really most importantly, is because I love rereading, but my TBR is so full of books that I haven't read before that I just never get a chance to reread. And I'm an avid rereader normally. Like, I love revisiting characters. I get very attached to characters and I miss them when I'm not in their world, and I just haven't been getting any rereading done, and it's really sad, and I really want to. So I feel like rereading on audio and having that as that's all I'm going to do, audiobooks are going to be rereads only, will allow me to continue experiencing audiobooks, which is something I really enjoy and I find really helpful to increase my amounts of reading time during the day, because it allows me to read during periods of time when I ordinarily might not be able to, like when albeit I do sometimes read while I'm walking to the station, but particularly in the winter when it's too dark outside at the beginning and end of the day, it lets me read while I'm walking to and from the station. It lets me read while I'm doing the cleaning. It lets me read while I'm brushing my teeth, while I'm having a shower, while I'm washing my face, etc, etc, etc. So it increases the amount of reading I can do, which I appreciate, and it's giving me the opportunity to reread books when maybe otherwise I wouldn't, and not maybe otherwise I wouldn't. I don't get to rereads because there's so many new books and backlist books that I want to get to, so I just never get round to rereading, and that's a shame. And so having audiobooks as my reread option means that I can read a new book as my main book, quote unquote, and I can have a reread on the go. So for example, at the moment I am listening to Eragon by Christopher Paolini, which is a book that I read for the first time when I was around 14 or 15 years old, and I don't think I ever finished the series because I had the intention of rereading books 1 to 3 before finishing off the series with book 4, and lo and behold, I didn't do the reread of books 1 to 3 because I never get around to it. So now I'm getting around to it. Before that, I read the His Dark Materials trilogy by Philip Pullman, which again I've been planning on rereading for quite some time and I just hadn't got around to it. So I feel like this is really working for me now. I've been doing it for a couple of months and I definitely think it's the way forward for my own personal reading. But in terms of top tips for people who want to branch into audiobooks, I think tip number 1 is find a narrative style that you like, and to do that, search for any actors that you know you like the voices of, any TV presenters or personalities or YouTubers or anything like that that you like the voice of. Use free audio books. Audible has a whole host of free audio shows that you can try out to see if you like any of those narrators, and of course libraries often have an audio library on their website or on an app. I know that lots of libraries are signed up to the app Libby, which I only just recently discovered and is very exciting. I need to get a library card to a library that is on Libby, but side issue. So access all of those kinds of things to find the kinds of narrators that you like. Tip number 2 is reread. Use audiobooks for rereading so that you can get used to what it's like to listen to a book instead of read a book on a page or an e-reader, and gain an understanding of how your concentration will be different, because it will be different. The reading experience on audio versus on the page is different and it feels different, and so listening to something you're familiar with will help you to familiarise yourself with that reading experience. And then number 3, once you've done 1 and 2 and you're ready to branch out into books that you haven't read before, I would recommend reading within a genre that you're already very, very familiar with, so that you can start to get used to listening to books that you haven't read before, and then and only then move on to maybe other genres and other types of narrative styles, and just give yourself the time to get used to it, because it is a change and it's worth it. It's worth the work, because audiobooks are great and they will really, really maximise your reading time. I think it's probably one of my top tips for anyone who asks me how can I read more. I say add audiobooks into your life, like have a physical book and an audiobook on the go, and you'll get twice as much reading done almost. So those are my tips for audiobook reading, and I hope it was useful. That's it for now. Thank you so much for watching. If you like this video and want to see more like this from me, then do think about hitting that subscribe button. I'd be so grateful, and I hope to see you again soon. Thanks. Bye.